Kuzi moves that Bill C-278, an act to amend the Lobbying Act, reporting obligations, be now read a second time and referred to the Standing Committee on Industry, Science and Technology. Debate, the Honourable Member for Renfrew-Nipissing-Pembroke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor on behalf of the hardworking people of the great riding of Renfrew-Nipissing-Pembroke to rise in my place and lead off the debate on legislation I've proposed before this House, Bill C-278. Bill C-278, which amends the Lobbying Act, will require lobbyists to disclose whether they are funded by a foreign national, a non-resident corporation, or a non-resident organization, and whether they use or expect to use grassroots communication to seek to persuade organizations or members of the public to take measures to obstruct, delay, or otherwise negatively affect any process that requires the Government of Canada to consult with the public before embarking on a specific course of action in attempt to place pressure on a public office holder to endorse a particular option. I was encouraged to propose this legislation by my concern to protect the jobs of my constituents in the working forest. The forestry industry is a significant employer in my riding, as it is in many other parts of Canada. It was brought to my attention that certain organizations were disseminating false information about the forestry industry in Canada. While some of these organizations operate under the pretext of having their anti-forestry activities financially supported by Canadians, careful research that was only possible by examining filings in countries outside Canada confirmed these organizations were being funded by non-Canadians, foreign actors with a hidden agenda. As it has been noted by the Canadian author Robert Lyman in Dark Green Money, a glimpse inside the big green funding machine, quote, Canadians should not have to find out about funding by foreign foundations of political interest groups in this country as a result of various citizens researching tax filings in the U.S. Internal Revenue Service, unquote. This problem is not confined to the anti-forestry lobby or those individuals who lobby to support or oppose the building of pipelines, to use a different example. And this challenge to Canadian democracy is not confined to any one country. This challenge, which my legislation seeks to address by requiring funding transparency, cuts across all levels of Canadian activity. This past weekend, in one of Canada's leading national newspapers, the National Post, in a full-page article, the following question was asked. The long arm of influence of China in Canada is a shadowy agency shaping opinion here. The shadowy agency in question is the United Front Work Department, a so-called shadowy offshoot of the Chinese Communist Party. That article proceeded to give specific examples of foreign funding, such as the Confucius Institute, described as a propaganda or espionage arm of the Chinese state, and how it is now operating at 3 school boards and on 9 university and college campuses across Canada. I quote political scientist Charles Bertrand from that story about a cultural association he was familiar with. Quote, an organization that once had another purpose has gradually been taken over to serve China's national interest. Where United Front work becomes problematic is when it's engaging persons of Chinese origin who have Canadian citizenship to serve the interests of the motherland, when in fact, the motherland should be Canada, unquote. This is a concern of the Chinese-Canadian community. I quote Chuck Kwan, head of the Toronto Association for Democracy in China. Quote, a lot of people don't think of the long arm of influence of China in Canada because they're under the influence, to put it mildly, he says. Outsiders like me, who is a Hong Kong immigrant, we see very clearly that this is a united front effort, a very subtle, soft power kind of advance into Canadian society. End of quote. While China may be in the news because of Meng Wanzhou and Chinese infotech giant Huawei in the ongoing Canada-China diplomacy crisis, let us not be too smug in Canada to dismiss the Russian meddling controversy playing south of the border. Macdonald Laurier Institute has prepared a paper entitled Stemming the Virus, Understanding and Responding to the Threat of Russian Disinformation. This document gives examples of Canada being a victim of Russian disinformation, including planted stories about the Minister of Defense, and in the case of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, focusing on her Ukrainian heritage. The planted stories about the Minister of Foreign Affairs were done in order to discredit Canada's position on the illegal occupation of Crimea by Russia. Another example cited by the article is the Russian foreign policy priority to use misinformation to put pressure on our parliament to repeal the Magnitsky legislation, which targets human rights abusers with targeted sanctions. In addition to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, my colleague on the Defense Committee, the member for Selkirk-Interlake Eastman, has been targeted by Russian propaganda for his Ukrainian heritage and his championing of international Magnitsky legislation. I also understand the member for Scarborough-Guildwood received a letter attacking his support for the Canadian Magnitsky legislation. Another Russian foreign policy priority, which I'm personally aware of as a veteran member of the Canada-NATO Parliamentary Association, is the targeting of NATO. NATO has been a pillar of peace and stability since the end of World War II. It's one of, if not the most important world organizations for peace and security. While not in the media lately as prominently as China and Russia, another country that is mentioned as being active in Canada is Iran. When it comes to foreign disinformation, one thing is in common. Canadian democracy is under attack. The purpose of using the Chinese and Russian examples was not intended in any way to single out members of those communities, the majority of whom are model Canadian citizens. It is, as Chuck Kwan stated, the problem is that many Canadians do not even realize they're under the influence of a disinformation campaign. While Parliament has focused on lobbying once the writ drops, for many Canadians, they've already been influenced by a subtle misinformation campaign paid with foreign money that's been ongoing for years. It's not good enough to look at measures only to combat election interference. Parliament needs to deal with foreign interference between elections also, which is the intent of Bill C-278, which we're debating today. Many members of the public, when they think of lobbying, think of the so-called public relations companies and the advertising firms that go along with those organizations. It goes far deeper than that. The announcement this week that 5 environmental nonprofit groups are lobbying the Senate Environment Committee not to consult directly with the Canadian public is an attack on democracy. While it was reported that one of the environmental groups has received significant taxpayer funding from the federal government, what was not reported were the millions of dollars the other environmental organizations receive from foreign sources. Let's start with the non-governmental organization NGO Echo Justice, formerly known as the Sierra Legal Defense Fund, which is the name of its American parent. According to the Canada Revenue Agency, this particular NGO in the 2000 to 2017 time period had gross revenues of $115 million, $319,392, and that's a lot of money. So where did they get all their millions? ECHO received 8 direct grants from the controversial U.S. Tides Foundation, totaling $545,380. The U.S. Tides Foundation flows money to its Canadian subsidiary, Tides Foundation Canada. CRA records show that Tides Foundation Canada gave 10 grants totaling $903,800 $845. They even tell us what Tides USA expected ECHO to use the money for. The money was used to attack the Canadian oil sands and the thousands of jobs that go with the oil sands. So the next question that needs to be answered is, who is donating millions of dollars to Tides USA, and what do they expect to get for their money? Could it be American pipeline interests? Could it be American oil and gas interests? Could it be the owners of American Rail who financially benefit when oil is shipped by rail than by pipeline? Canadians have a right to the answers to these questions. C-278 would provide those answers. In an era where foreign interests can launch 1 million emails with the push of a button, we need those answers now more than ever. In a democracy, a free and independent press is counted on to provide unbiased information and informed opinions that aid public debate, expose corruption, and highlight major social issues to enable an informed public to make participatory decisions. Today's reality is far from that ideal. In Canada, media is looking at an almost $600 million government bailout of its corporate owners claim they need to operate. This creates more opportunities for foreign entities with deep pockets to buy public acceptance for policies that promote their interests. The role played by foreign governments as well as foreign foundations in campaigns to influence public policy in Canada should be of interest to all concerned about the independence and integrity of Canadian political and governmental processes. The increasing globalization of corporate, institutional, and geopolitical interests would seem to require that Canadian democratic institutions be more vigilant about these possible intrusions. This, in turn, demands that reports on the activities of foundations, other nonprofits, and charities seeking to influence policy be made more transparent to the public and more useful to parliamentarians who wish to exercise oversight. Greater transparency afforded in two areas that would benefit greatly from a more open system of reporting and increased oversight are the lobbyist registry and the reporting requirements to the CRA by nonprofit and charitable organizations. In addition to the concerns expressed previously about the role of foreign and corporate actors, the transparency of disclosing by lobbyists and charities is being increasingly obscured by the efforts of various interests to mask self-dealing and self-vested interests. In the United States, there's a large body of academic studies examining the strategies and practices used by private foundations to influence public policy. And many of these foundations have enormous financial resources, including billions of dollars in assets and hundreds of millions of dollars in annual revenues. Increasingly, U.S. studies have addressed the strategies used by private foundations and the many other groups they fund, most of which have charity, a non-taxable status, by influencing policy. The strategies include broad communications and education programs to influence public perceptions of policy issues and to garner public support for specific actions, the lobbying of governments at all levels, infiltration of the media, and concerted, coordinated action to achieve specific objectives. And while there's less information and academic analysis available in Canada, some private researchers have made efforts to follow the money in terms of how foundations and charity funding is used. These efforts are impeded by superficial reporting requirements and the lack of publicly available information from organizations like Canada Revenue Agency, which administers provisions of the Income Tax Act related to charities, and the lobbying registry compiled by the Office of the Commissioner of Lobbying of Canada. Researchers such as Vivian Krause, who have endeavored to find out more about the use of domestic and foreign foundation funding for anti-oil and anti-pipeline campaigns, have learned they must often rely on the U.S. Internal Revenue Service records since the information they seek is not available from Canadian sources. In the United States, a donor-advised fund, DAF, is a charitable giving vehicle administered by a public charity created but to manage charitable donations on behalf of organizations, families, or individuals. Although DAFs are more developed in the United States, they're increasingly being used in Canada. To participate in a DAF, a donating individual or organization opens an account in the fund, deposits the cash, securities, or other financial instruments. The donor surrenders the ownership of anything put in the fund, but retains advisory privileges over how the account is invested and how it distributes its money to charities. And in the charity sector, the increased use of DAF funds makes it increasingly difficult to determine the ultimate source and purpose of funding.
Questions and comments, questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable colleague for the efforts in a private member's bill for greater transparency. I wonder if she's disturbed that the Fraser Institute has received $4.3 million in foreign funding to run campaigns that include ones that defend pipelines, amounts of money staggeringly larger than the ones that U.S. foundations have given some environmental groups.
Member for Renfrew-Nipissing-Pembroke.
Well, obviously, for the member in the back corner, this is disturbing to her, which is why this really should be a non-partisan bill. That transparency should include all parties. It should unite us all. Mm-hmm. And if foreign donations to an organization that is conservative in nature is of concern, then I hope that she too will lend her support to this bill so that not only conservative oriented foundations, institutes declare where they're getting their money from, but other foundations and charities as well.
Questions and comments, questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Mr. Speaker, with the Lobbying Act within it, there's a statutory review of the legislation, and my question to the member is related to that aspect of the legislation. Has she looked into the possibility of maybe how she might be able to bring this type of issue up once that act is under review from the House of Commons? That'd be one issue, and the second one would be in regards to what would she anticipate would be additional costs incurred, because surely to goodness if you were to expand in this area there'd be a fairly substantial cost to it, because I'm sure she's not trying to imply that we would in any way try to not properly resource the current commissioner in being able to do the fine work that office does currently.
The honourable member for Renfrew-Nipissing-Pembroke.
Thank you. And once again, I appreciate my greatest fan being here for, once again, tabling another piece of legislation, and I appreciate his input immensely. In fact, we're approaching an election, and time is of the essence. We know that they're very concerned about foreign interference because earlier this week they put forth a plan to ensure that there wasn't interference in the electoral process. But even before the election starts, we have active campaigns that are trying to influence Canadian policy that's underway. And while a review may happen in another few years, we need this to pass now. And it's not involving a lot of money. It's just doing more reporting that we're already doing. And the reporting should be done on the part of the people lobbying. So the lobbyists, instead of just putting the list of partner organizations, parent organizations, what they have to do is indicate all the organizations, the ultimate donors, the individuals, and if they're going to engage a grassroots organization to influence the opinion of Canadians, they will need to report what who those grassroots organizations are and the method that they're going to try to convince people to go to their way of thinking. And any foreign income coming towards this will have to be reported. Also, on the part of the grassroots campaigners and nonprofit organizations, if they are going to be accepting foreign dollars to influence how Canadians are going to form our own laws, they also will have to report. Now, we're not saying that they cannot accept money from foreign entities. What we're saying is if they do accept money from foreign entities, that they have to disclose it. Thank you.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the President of the Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, thank you for this opportunity to participate in the debate on Bill C-278. Canada has achieved remarkable success as a free, open, and prosperous democracy. We can be proud of our reputation as one of the best countries in the world in which to live. We have world-class cities